So, the USA has a Space Force now, and people are ripping the piss. And it's kind of understandable. I mean, I get it. Trump's a clown. US military overspend is a joke, Yeah. And, Steve Carell's made a whole comedy series about taking the piss out of the Space Force. But I'm going to be devil's advocate here and say, perhaps the Space Force isn't such a bad thing after all. Now, let me just take you back 100 years, back to 1918, the First World War. And the UK created the world's first Air Force. Never been done before. And what they did was, because military aviation basically just blew up in the First World War. It went from nothing to, suddenly, oh, we've got planes now. But should we have an Air Force? So the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Army's aviation corps, and the Royal Naval Air Service, which belongs to the Navy, were taken out of the Army and the Navy and smushed together to form the Royal Air Force. And of course, everything that the US Space Force is going through right now in terms of, hang on, we need uniforms and we need rank titles and how are we going to organise this whole thing. The Royal Air Force went through the exact same thing back in 1918. So for the first year, they were still sort of wearing their khaki uniform, and in 1919 they were given the RAF uniform has been ever since, the blue uniform, and sky blue. It looks nice. It was different, and they said, right, we're going to have blue uniform, and it's basically the Army's SD uniform but blue. And they took for the ranks, they took the officer ranks from the Royal Naval Air Service and the enlisted ranks from the Royal Flying Corps and combined the two systems. And that's been the Royal Air Force ever since. The US didn't get its own Air Force until 1947. So until then, the US Army Air Force, it was part of the Army. 1947, US Air Force, and they came along with their own uniform in sort of 1948, and the same sort of time period. It took them years to get blue uniforms and all that, and they've gone for a slightly darker blue. It's more like a Prussian blue, slightly darker blue than the RAF, and for the officers they've kept the same ranks as the Army. For the enlisted crew, the rank titles are the same, but they changed the design of the stripes. It's more of a sort of wiggly. I think it's meant to look like wings. I don't know. They've gone for these wiggly stripes, and that uniform pretty much stayed the same, except that there was a brief period in 1991 under a General McPeak. And sorry, that's the thing. I'm going to put images over here. Yeah, this guy, General McPeak, came along and says, I'm going to make a uniform that looks... Well, what they did was they took the cuff stripes, they basically... They made it look like it looks like an airline uniform, in all honesty. It's a single-breasted jacket with cuff stripes, but they're still using the Army rank titles. And it was not popular, it didn't last very long, and then went back to the more military style jackets after that. So, 2019, President Trump says, we're going to have a Space Force. Which is, I mean, humans have been in space since 1957, and for most of that time the biggest user of space has been the military. In the Cold War it was all about spying and putting satellites up to spy satellites to gather intelligence and spy on the Russians, or the Russians were setting up to spy on the NATO countries. And it's taken them this long to actually decide we're going to have a space force. So, So now Space Force is a thing. Spaceships. So basically, the new Space Force is basically carrying on what the US Air Force Space Command has been doing all this time. And they're going through the same process that the RAF did in 1918 and what the USAF did in 1947. Okay, we need new uniforms, we need new rank titles. What they've done, and I'm going to put images on screen now, this is what it's going to look like. And they've gone back to pointy chevrons for sergeants, although interestingly they're pointing down, they're the British way up instead of the American. You look at the American Army and the chevrons always point up the way. US Space Force, chevrons pointing down the way. So there are no corporals. They've gone for, I think it's specialist 1, 2, 3, 4 for the ranks up to corporal equivalent, and then sergeant is everything from sergeant above is pretty much the same as the Air Force. The officers are all keeping the same army style ranks, so that's not going to change from US Air Force. A lot of people saying, and Trekkies and Halo fans and all that, saying, oh, they should have Navy style ranks because spaceships. And I like the idea, and obviously that's what the Royal Air Force has for its officers. Should we have Navy style ratings as well? Chief Petty Officer, etc. Like they have on Star Trek. But no, they're keeping it the same as the US Air Force, which is Army style. Of course, they don't have any spaceships. They're not, it's not Star Trek. They're not blasting off to other planets on starships. They're basically controlling satellites from a control room, under a mountain somewhere. So, is it? Should they or should they not have Navy style rankings? I don't know. Of course, if Britain ever, in the unlikely event that Britain has the Space Force, we'd probably keep it the way the RAF is. The RAF has its own Space Command that's been launched, but again, it's staying within the RAF. We're not creating a separate corps or a separate force. It's just, it's a command within the RAF. So, what do you think about the Space Force? What do you think about the uniforms? What do you think about, should they have gone Navy style? Please comment in the comments. It's an interesting bit of, we live in interesting times. Alright, and see you later.